Hi everyone, it's my pleasure to introduce Sharon Meraz. She's a professor of communication and a lot of her work focuses on political activism and engagement online, and particularly how that's affected novel information-based technology. And today she's going to be talking about some of her work and also focusing on CSS more broadly as a combination of theory and method. So welcome, Sharon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Sharon Meraz, and I'm an associate professor at University of Illinois Chicago. It's great to talk to all of you students, early career researchers, both here in Chicago as well as the satellite sites. So I'd like to talk a bit today about, as Natalie mentioned, sort of giving not only a summation of CSS and computational social science in terms of its state in the field right now, its challenges, its advantages, its disadvantages, but also talking a little bit about some of the projects that I've been doing, and then sort of giving you guys a guide as to some ways that you can incorporate these methods into future work. So, from the earliest article written around 2009, we've seen since then about 10 years of development with computational methods in our social science field. And it's now actually matured to include some very definite methodological strands in terms of harvesting as well as combining social media data. I don't know how many of the workshops have already been addressing some of these areas, but there are three very, very large areas right now: network analysis, semantic and automated text analysis. Those two areas are primarily the ones I work in, but there's also agent-based predictive modeling. Now, something that I wanted to bring up, and something that you might find very prevalent when you start investigating as early career researchers as well as students, how to incorporate computational social sciences, you might often find that many of the readings sort of approach it as signaling the end of theory, sort of like data for data's sake, data being able to point the way towards theory. And I would say that in a lot of my time working with computational social science methods, and I probably began around 2007 and 2008 when I was doing my dissertation, I don't necessarily see CSS approaches as solely capable of engendering sort of like an empiricist mode of knowledge production independent of existing theoretical frameworks. Instead, I would say that my work is formed and guided by the architecture and the politics of socio-technical platforms in which knowledge is created, produced, and distributed. And my data gathering and analysis tends to be informed by pre-existing theoretical frameworks. So what I tend to do is I utilize CSS as a way to reinvent, reshape, and sort of inform new theoretical processes and frameworks that either coexist within or live outside theoretical traditions. In other words, a data-driven science tends to be theoretically informed, guided by theory. Often my questions tend to be generated from pre-existing theoretical frameworks that sort of guide the way my data is gathered, analyzed, assessed. And oftentimes my output tends to point back to revisions to the theory, ways that the theory can be stretched or improved, though new processes might emerge as a result of utilizing pre-existing theory to guide the way that I pull data. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when you see some of the projects that I have been doing over the past 2 years. I also want to point to the fact that a lot of the work that I tend to do in politics tends to be very situated, very reflexive, paying attention to larger societal, political, economic, and cultural positionalities, which means that it is generally guided by theory, okay, as opposed to just being data in an exploratory sense. I don't see data as neutral, but I see it imbued with societal and political effects. Now, what a lot of my work strands related to, I tend to do or utilize CSS methodologies towards the study of political communication, political science, societal phenomena, as well as political social networks. So I tend to examine theories of political networks and existing digital social network emergence through frameworks such as the following. I examine partisan selective exposure, attention, and partisan motivated reasoning. I look a lot at cocooning, fragmentation, the dangers of homophilous social network exposure as it relates to a variety of different things. They include things like tolerance, diversity of opinion sharing, network composition and heterogeneous knowledge production. Lately, I've been looking a lot at toxicity and hate speech online, as a lot of my recent work over the past 2 years has pointed to a lot of toxic and hateful discourse online. I also look at how networked publics and their attitudes are shaped in relation to government, political parties. I look a lot at social movements and social protests. Continuing on with that, because my work involves political structures, it often also engages with larger traditional authority structures within society. So I also look at journalism and the impact of networked publics and the things that they focus on, the media that they draw on, and how that relates to the remediated and hybrid media ecology, and how that impacts networked agenda setting in relation to news sources and sources of authority. I also look a lot at the platforms themselves and the politics of platforms. And that includes the role of algorithmic curation and networks in gatekeeping and framing, and how that relates to information creation and dissemination. I also look at the impact of these automated forms of content assemblage on the authority of media and government. Now, another thing that came to my attention over the past couple of years, and something that actually has been written about maybe over the past 4 or 5 years, where people have started to really do intensive research on this, is the growth of bots and computational propaganda, and the rise of fake news and disinformation campaigns. Now, for many of us that study computational social science, in politics, we are finding ourselves very much not only driven towards examining toxicity, hate online, but also examining the growth of this, sort of disinformation wave, right, as it expresses itself in algorithms or automated code bots and sort of campaigns, and that's where computational propaganda comes in, right, when these things are actually leveraged by political actors, right, to shift or manipulate public opinion. And my work, as I mentioned before, and I found a fruitful way forward utilizing these methodologies, is to work within existing theoretical frameworks which help to guide the type of questions that I ask, the type of data that I draw on. But it does not mean that these theories are static, but that we as new media researchers must sort of revise, sort of reinvent theoretical frameworks that were built on an older media ecology, something that was very one-way, towards something that's more fluid, networked, multimodal, multi-theoretical. Now, how have I seen sort of those existing theories morph? I found myself also examining a lot of new theories of information diffusion. So many of you might be familiar with some of these newer theories of contagion, cascades, memetics, virality. And I have myself altered a couple of the theories of gatekeeping and framing into a more networked context. And I refer to that as network gatekeeping and network framing. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. I work a lot with social network analysis and social influence theories, and these would relate to things like social contagion theories, right? I look a lot at computational propaganda bots, where I try to quantify their growth, detect them, and also examine their role in disinformation campaigns. A lot of my work is also on social movements, looking at how contentious publics, that's broadcasting and listening, supportive and dissenting publics, engage in the process not only of information sharing, but also campaigning either for or against something, right? Whether they're seeking to destabilize a movement or delegitimize it or create noise, or how successful supportive publics are, right, in waging sort of global campaigns online. And a lot of my methodological work when it comes to computational social science work relates to data mining, digital trace data, screen scraping, a lot of NLP work, primarily in Python. And I also do a lot of social network analysis mining of communities online by scraping and then automating the creation of those data matrices for analysis. So a lot of my work is in automated content analysis. And I also actually use a lot of traditional forms of analysis in order to not only spot check and validate methods, but improve the automated process along. So, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about how those things are done in some of my work. Now, you've probably encountered multiple definitions already of CSS, and they are scattered across the literature, right? So I'll just, cite a couple, but, as we go along, we'll talk more about what it is. But it refers to the interdisciplinary conduct of social science research through an information processing and complex adaptive systems paradigm using computation as the key enabling scientific methodology. So what's interesting about defining the states through which computational social science methods sort of investigate as complex and adaptive is that what we're also describing is something that's changing states and encompassing what we call phase transitions, right? It encompasses a multi-stage process. It's not something that's static, but it's dynamic, with participants coming in and out in that state of connectivity. And what's really great about computational social science methods is that it enables you to study something that's complex, adaptive, dynamic, and changing state, right? This author also refers to computational social science as proficiency in the interdisciplinary integration of knowledge in the context of social phenomena, including the synergistic nexus between social science and computational methodologies. Now, clearly, it sort of captures a shift, a research paradigm shift into social sciences. Now, it's not a new thing. This has been going on for over a decade now, where social scientists have, sort of married their methodologies to something that's more computational. And if you were to start doing readings in this particular area, in addition to many of the special issues and journals for which you might find over the past 4 years, there have been several dedicated volumes in the separate journals on computational social science, as well as several new books at the forefront. You realize that what many of these books and journals are pointing to is the suitability of computational social science to the study of something that's more interactive and dynamic in terms of connectivity, as well as dealing with all of the multiple interactions that are engendered by socio-technical architectures and social media. Social computation tends to afford endogenous interactive network structures to emerge in situated contexts. Now, what's also great about utilizing these methodologies is that they enable you to capture those changing structural perspectives that emanate from users in their personalized forms of digital activism. Whether these activisms are conscious acts, we find a lot of them are unconscious acts, like people go online, they might mindlessly share something, or they might engage in a retweeting behavior, which, again, later down in the presentation, I'll point to the fact that sometimes a lot of what we're aggregating and studying is not really the intent of the audience, right? As much as it is our larger sort of attempt to understand, right, what publics are doing online. What's been a source of power for computational social science is these massive troves of data, right, which we tend to create in our form of ambient awareness, 24/7 connectivity. I found this article by Rob Kitchen to really capture what big data does or is bringing to the field. It's huge in volume, high in velocity, diverse in variety, exhaustive in scope, fine-grained in resolution, relational in nature, flexible and scalable. So the advantages of adopting a computational social science approach is that it enables and gives you the capacity to collect and analyze data with great breadth and depth, and provides you new tools for collection, processing via algorithmic solutions such as natural language processing and machine learning. It also creates a new paradigm of force in our field, where we are called to embrace methods of prediction alongside and not solely married to theories of explanation. What I mean by theories of explanation is social scientists, if you're trained in these generally so in social scientific methods, you're accustomed to trying to find something statistically significant and then sort of telling you that, yes, it's pointing in the direction suggested by the theory, right? But that's not really the way computational social science methodologies work, right? What computational methods open up is new domains of analysis. Now, for any of you engaging in this week research, you realize that you're moving away from things like just self-reporting surveys to actually observing data by a digital trace. You're moving from the lab and experiments to something that's actually naturally occurring in the world. through looking at social technologies. You're moving away from small samples to bigger data sets, and you're no longer actually required to report the sample size, for example, right? Which everybody wanted at between 8 and 10%. Nowadays, as we are scraping digital data, that's not what we're doing, right? And it's also interactive because you're weaving between computational methods and human-centered design, which is iterative, symbiotic, and relationship. And as I mentioned before, on some of the projects I'll go through, my preferred style of working with computational social science is more of a symbiotic relationship between myself and the computational methods that get continuously rehoned and retrained as I examine the output, look at it, realize how they can be even more fine-grained and fine-tuned, and then I work again on rewriting the scripts and the algorithms in order to get an even better and better output than just allowing the machine completely unsupervised, right? My preference is more for a supervised form of analysis, but both methods work, right? Unsupervised and supervised. Computational social science has its advantages in that it alters all facets of methodological inquiry. From your sampling, there's no longer normal distribution, for example, as many of you know, when you look at these web networks, especially networks that have matured beyond a certain point due to growth and preferential attachment, is that there is going to be a power law, right, where there are few influencers with the majority of the participants, stretched along very low levels of participation down the long tail. That certainly alters the nature of how you study networks and who you focus on. There's also a level of deduction in old methods, whereas in computational social science, there's a push more towards inductive and abductive methods. Variables are no longer measured via attributes in that particular social science survey sort of instrument design, but you look at social network data. And you also examine a lot of case studies in computational social science as you examine the communities and the boundaries around them, and you scrape the necessary data for that specific community. It's generative and predictive as opposed to solely explanatory, and it can take account of social complexity, lived experience, right? In other words, what's great about computational social science is that you're less intrusive in the data collection, and you're more examining the lived experience, right? What's actually occurred online without you, unless you're an ethnographer, really going in there and participating, so to speak, in altering the nature of the data collection. What's great about computational social science, if you're into prediction or predictive models, is that you're able to model and simulate. That can lead to further understanding of the mechanisms of information processing. The other great thing is that you have control over timing of the observations. You can do repeated capture pulls of the data, right, as opposed to just one snapshot at a time. So these are all great reasons for why to adopt a computational social science approach in your specific work. Now, how do I use these methods in my work? As I mentioned before, I tend to do a lot of work both in automated content analysis and text and semantic network analysis, and also social network analysis. So those are my two areas that I engage in the utilization of heavy computational methods, right? Now, what do those tend to look like? They tend to look like data mining, where I mine digital trace data, either from my own pre-designated scripts using existing tools that I might tweak via Python scripting, and also screen scraping, right? And also pulling from APIs, right? Which, as you well know, many of these technologies have an API that you can write against and pull, okay, data from. So that's kind of where a lot of my data mining occurs. And again, a lot of these things are very well documented online, right? If you were to try to figure out, for example, how to access an application programming interface. And I work with a lot of the existing social media. I don't do a lot of stuff on Instagram or YouTube, but we'll talk a little more about that. I do a lot of natural language processing, primarily in Python, and a lot of my work is supervised text mining and text analysis, as well as the automated forms of content analysis, which can include anything like cluster analysis, supervised topic modeling, categorization into morphological, affective, and cognitive categories, and supervised text analysis and categorization, which is labeling a training data set to inform the predictors, which are generally my scripts, and a lot of manual effort that goes back and forth in the tweaking of that to eventually result in statistical types of modelings, right? Whether it's time series analysis, or logistic regression, or network analysis. Now, I also do a lot of social network analysis methodologies as well, and again, that would involve scraping communities online for their networked relationships, and then mining that, utilizing trace data within those connections to build network matrices, and then engaging in building of those matrices. And again, that involves a lot of pre-processing and parsing, cleaning with scripting, and then using things like NLPs and machine language for the matrices, and then visualization technologies. I've done less work, but I'm working currently as well on sentiment analysis and emotional content, which does, as you engage in it, will involve building dictionaries of emotive and affective words. And then very, very similarly, utilizing those dictionary-based methods against scripts that are predictors, right, to be able to train those classifiers for being able to code sentiment. And there also are existing tools. Researchers use things like LIWC and SentiStrength, which I have not used either of those to analyze sentiment. So what are the projects and findings that drive my work? Now, I find the best computational social science projects are ones that are driven by a set of solid theoretical ideas, right, as opposed to just collecting data and let's see what happens, right, when we run it, which I know is an approach, an exploratory approach, and it's a fun approach as well, right, because that's how you get a sense of what's going on online. But you find often that the best ways to figure out what data to pull, what boundaries to draw, is often driven theoretically, right, by pre-existing ideas about what you might want to examine online, right? So here are some of the things that drives my work. As I mentioned before, I'm a political comm scholar, a political social network analysis scholar. I'm interested in aspects of social movements, contentious publics, political campaigns and elections, social movements, and just uprisings that occur in general. And here are some of the things that drives my work. I ask, how can endogenous, bounded, and decentralized political actors generate regularity and meaning in otherwise ad hoc emergent networks? 2, how do connectionist structures emerge to foster and promote networked gatekeepers and networked frames about political movements and political events, and how do those things rise to the fore? 3, how do theories of cascades, virality, and mean-based information transmission and adaptation models enable us to understand the nature of information diffusion within these political imagined communities and networks and across social media's interconnected architectures? 4, during heightened times, how do our social media tools and platforms enable generative knowledge to emerge via their socio-technical artifices? And what do these emergent pools of knowledge suggest about the nature of authority and credibility of media, government, and political elites and institutions? 5, what role is social media, algorithmic architectures, and platform politics playing in shaping democratic outcomes and altering democratic citizenship? And 6, what do social media architectures do to alter the political process and the role and authority of media and political parties? So as you can see, I'm very much interested in the role that these technologies are playing in democracy, in democratic structures, in altering facets of traditional authority like political elites, media elites, the institutions that we hold near and dear in our democracy. And I'm also interested in what new sort of theoretical domains sort of capture the new networked relationships that we're seeing online. And this relates not only to the facets of structures that are connectionist and decentralized in activity, but also newer information transmission models that I think better capture the way information flows online in a more horizontal, decentralized, multi-flow, multi-theoretical sort of way, right? So there's things like cascades, virality, mean-based formats. So as I mentioned before, I find it more fruitful when working with computational methodologies to first have an idea theoretically of where I'm going in research, right? And the new theories that myself and my co-author, Papa Carisi, came up with, network gatekeeping and network framing, emanated from us examining the behavior of Occupy publics that engaged in the Occupy Wall Street movement. And we realized that the way that they were interacting with each other and how gatekeepers and how framing occurred was very, very different, right? After we examined the network from what traditional gatekeeping and framing suggested to us. And this is how, at the very end of the paper, we revised the gatekeeping and framing to take account of a networked context. So we revised it in this manner. We redefined gatekeeping as network gatekeeping. And we defined it as a process through which actors are crowdsourced to prominence through the use of conversational social practices that symbiotically connect the elite and the crowd in the determination of information relevancy. Now, this has a lot of throwback to the existing gatekeeping theory, except for the main fact. But we're trying to say that as opposed to actors having the press pass or just being political elites, they're crowdsourced to prominence through actions within the crowd that sort of are conversational and social in nature, right? And we also realize that network gatekeeping allows elites and the crowd to, at some point in time, trade off an influence, right? Now, how that trade-off occurs is really the beauty of the computational social science method, because we can examine that, right, in depth, in an in-depth manner when we investigate and look at the data. Same with network framing, we revise Entman's definition, right, to take account of a more crowd-centered process. So we define it as a process through which particular problem definitions, causal interpretations, moral evaluations, and treatment recommendations attain prominence through crowdsourcing practices. Again, that's essentially Entman's definition, right? Revised to take account for a crowd-centered context. Okay, and again, we could not have come up with that definition did we not have a theoretical vein in mind when we were first examining the data set, right? And then realize in examining it that these processes that are one way no longer work, right? Because we need to take account for something that's more multi-step and multi-flow. So this was one example of a theoretical innovation and revision that could sort of guide when you're doing computational social science, working with pre-existing theory, but also realizing that pre-existing theory may not fit exactly what your data will reveal. And when you do your analysis, you're able to then revise the theory. As researchers like ourselves are all keen and eager to see not only us, but younger generations of scholars and young professors work with the older one-way theories to revise them for something that's more multi-flow and multi-step. So as I mentioned before, we realize that there are crowd-centered processes. This all occurs because there are different mechanics in social media that allow this digital activism of networked publics to alter the form of live news events as they unfold. They engage in hybridity in conventional journalistic paradigms, changing news values and traditional media institutions. The ambience and the social awareness results in different forms of conversational practices online and gestures, right, that are facilitated by the metrics of tools, everything from your likes to your upvotes to your retweets. And we realized that the space, the social space that we were examining involved not a socially constructed, infused news stream of very diverse actors, citizen actors, alternative media, but also mainstream institutions. So I want to go through a little bit now some of the projects that I've been working on over the past couple of years on how I've used computational social science methods. Now, all of the projects that I will now describe and the findings from them involve a variety of all of these different methods, right? Screen scraping, NLP, Python, machine learning, cluster and community analysis, social network analysis, automated content analysis, and network and semantic text analysis. All right, so a variety of different methods. Many of these studies may have had 3 or 4 of the different methods working in tandem together. But as I mentioned before, I don't do predictive modeling. I do primarily on network analysis and text analysis and automated content analysis. So this is where the majority of my computational social science approaches reside, right, in this primary form of methodology. Now, one of the projects that I did with my co-author, Papa Carisi, and this is what led to the revision of gatekeeping and framing into the theoretical extensions of network gatekeeping and network framing, came from the Occupy Wall Street movement that we analyzed. Where we examined, this is the Arab Spring, movement. Now we examined tweets over the course of the Arab Spring in 2011, and we found that we actually found something that was quite interesting. Most networks are characterized by a power law, right, where only a few actors gain prominence. What we found after looking at an entire month of Arab Spring tweets was that there tended to be a more egalitarian participation among the diverse publics. There was less of a power law. There was less degree centrality of the actors. There was more voice, less eliteness, more participants. And semantic network analysis revealed that there was strong counterframing, right? Not only by those that were engaged in supporting the movement, but also supported publics that were trying to frame their own movement. So what was very interesting about this was that we found a difference in terms of the power law, right? Whereas most networks trend towards a power law, we found in this particular case that there was much less of a power law. Now, I've been doing a lot of work in the 2016 election, and actually a variety of different projects, probably about 10 already, and counting. I'll be going to the American Political Science Association in August, and also doing a couple projects on that as well. And I've done a lot of work on fake news in the 2016 US election, and I've done multiple projects. And most of these projects, which have now probably in excess of over 10 million tweets for these projects, have observed in conservative and progressive feeds across different hashtag communities that fake news was primarily shared by conservative publics in social media feeds, and fake news drove the agendas, accounting in some cases for over 40% of the news shared, when compared with less than 5% of democratic networked publics. Now, this finding was also echoed actually in a replicated sense by many other studies that have been done by other authors, right, in a variety of other realms, which is sort of trending towards, from computational social science, a very somewhat robust finding, right, that we're finding now of some concern that conservatives appear to be sharing more fake news than progressive and liberal communities. Conservative publics and the majority of my tweets that I have found, and these millions tended to castigate and accuse media of fake news dissemination while sharing a significant amount of information from fake news sites, as well as Breitbart, InfoWars, YouTube channels, conservative talk radio. SoundCloud tends to be a very big source for conservatives, and Fox News. So there was a strong tendency among these publics to not only seed fake news, but amplify fake news, right? And many of these narratives in 2016 resided in demonizing immigrants, Islamophobia, which was huge, spreading fake news about Clinton and Obama, the resurrection of birtherism, as opposed to focusing on news of the day. And these conservative sites engaged in tactics of information distraction as well, which were sort of mini campaigns that were waged within the daily back and forth of tweeting, right? That sought to not only delegitimize Clinton, but also sort of, deflect attention away from the scandals, right, that were erupting about Trump. This is a very small little diagram there, but as you can see from this site shared, after doing scripting and aggregating across the many different things, you see that sites like YouTube, and there's a site, Fallen Angel, which was a conspiracy about the Navy SEALs, the 6 Navy SEALs, InfoWars, Breitbart, a lot of SoundCloud. These are the primary sites that the conservatives shared in comparison to liberals. And these, again, this data like this has been replicated and found in many other studies that liberals, progressives tend to share more mass media. If they do share progressive blogs, they tend to be things like the Huffington Post, which, as we know, actually has a high level of credibility. But there definitely tends to be more mass media shared by progressives than there is by conservatives. Now, another thing that I was interested in 2016 was religious publics, because as you well know, they came out for Trump in high numbers. And there tends to be a lot of leveraging of the religious vote during electoral times, right? So I was curious about how religious publics networked on Twitter. So for that, I had a sample size of about 3 million tweets. And what we did was wrote some scripts to access user profiles and scraped their description of themselves from there. In addition to them tweeting from specific feeds and scraping a random sample of their feeds and then utilizing that to suggest what their ideological orientation was. We were able to try to then situate those religious publics within space, within geographical space. So I was using geolocation as well. There's a field in tweets that can suggest, if you play with it a little bit, geolocation, right? So we utilized that, and I was really interested in where religious publics were located, what part of the United States they were, whether they were more tweeting for the conservatives versus progressives. I expected that to be the case anyway. And what we found was that progressive religious publics tend to be less overt about their religion. They tend to be few and far between, and they tend to be very sparsely located. You also find that conservative religious publics tend to be very heavily networked and dense, and they tend to actually network with each other, which is very, very different from progressives. So this is what religious users, for progressives, this is where they were located. If you look at just a different coloration, like a heat map for what it looks like for progressives and conservatives, you can see that conservatives are much denser, right? And they pick up way more of U.S. territory, right, than, say, progressive religious publics. And if you look at the way they organize, this is just the top 200 that we pulled from there. They have a lot more dense connections than, say, progressives, right, who don't really connect that much, right, as opposed to, say, the dense connectivity of religious conservatives and the way they are located across the majority of the United States in comparison to the way progressives orient themselves, suggests that conservative religious publics are a very strong base for conservative politics, right? And it's certainly one of the areas I will be looking at in the 2020 presidential election, because it's clearly suggested here that the way they network and in their dense concentration across the United States in specific swing state areas suggest a strong sort of networked public, right, support of a conservative candidate. So I did some work in immigration. So obviously, in looking at a lot of our work with fake news, we realized that a lot of immigration stories are driven by conservative publics, right? Who, given the state of immigration and migration, not only within the United States, but globally, I was interested in to what extent the way immigration was studied on 2016 enabled us to sort of understand the differences in the way networked publics that are conservative discuss it in comparison to the way progressive publics examine it. So I looked at millions of tweets with the designate immigration as hashtag, and I was examining the extent to which there were differences in conservative and progressive discussion. What I found was that conservatives tended to discuss immigration alongside anti-immigration narratives that was arising in Europe, specifically with the Syrian refugees, as well as with the Brexit vote. Trump publics were more likely to also connect immigration domestically to a host of issues that were economic, in other words, suggesting that immigration had a deleterious effect on the very fabric of American existence, right? It was connected to, among conservatives, much more issues, right? Issues that were then thus framed in a very negative sense. Should the immigrants come, this negative will happen and that negative will happen. And as opposed to, and I'll show you the maps in a bit, progressive Clinton publics, which were actually less likely to focus on immigration because for them, immigration is a healthy thing, right? America is built on immigrants, right? So what was actually quite interesting was there was much less dialogue about immigration among progressive publics, whereas there was heavy framing and counter-framing on the part of conservative publics. And what's very interesting also is that the Latinx population tends to be largely disconnected from conversation about immigration, right? And I'm referring here to publics that identify as Latino or Hispanic, right? And that does not only mean within the United States, but these could also be immigrants from Mexico, as well as people from different territories, right, that identify by either the tag Latinx, Hispanic, or Latino. So these are kind of some of the major hashtag relationships that emanated from those millions of tweets across the United States and globally, actually, because what we find is there's a huge debate here with the Syrian refugees as well with the Brexit vote. If you look at Trump's immigration hashtag network, all you really should focus in on is how many different issues you see emanating there. But this is what the progressive network looks like when they talk about immigration. There are very few issues because, you know, they didn't make, you know, as big a deal about it, right? As say the conservatives who connected it to every and which issue, right? And this is what the Latinx immigration hashtag network looks like. It's very disconnected, right, from an in-depth sort of investigation and treatment of immigration and what it means for their lives. Now, I've also done a fair amount of work on Black lives because I was interested in 2016, given the dynamics of the election and certain societal variables. Now, this is something I'd actually like to point out. When you're doing computational social science, I find it makes it most meaningful is if you can think of things in a situated context, right? Having social, political ramifications or effects. Why I was interested specifically, not just because Black Lives Matter is actually a leading hashtag on Twitter. Twitter's done a lot of statistics on what are some of its most prevalent hashtags, and by far, Ferguson and Black Lives Matter remain the first and third most used hashtag in the 10-year history of Twitter, which already suggests to you that Black Lives Matter as a public is an extremely political public. When I collect data on Black Lives by just random analysis, tweets of 50,000 data files at a time turn over in literally an hour or two because people are tweeting so heavily to this hashtag. But I was interested in Black Lives because of the dynamics of 2016, the populism, the anti-establishment politics, the rise of white nationalism, which is well recorded, so not in dispute, the growth of hate speech online, and also the rise of bots and computational propaganda. You know, during the 2016 election, there was a lot of quite racist commentary, right, made by Trump towards Black publics in general, as well as immigrant publics. And I was interested as well to see to what extent the Black Lives Matter movement, how they were sort of, you know, networking in a situation like this. But these are just some graphs. I'm still working on this paper actually. And it shows again, like you find a regular power law in terms of the fact that very few people tweet a lot. Most people only tweet between 1 time and 100 times. I was interested in where bots are sort of located along in terms of popularity. And what I found that was really interesting about this computationally was that bots were located across the entire long tail of participation. They were prevalent among as accounts that were the most prolific. They were prevalent in the middle tier. They were prevalent all the way to accounts that just tweeted once or tweeted 10 times. In other words, what this suggests to me is a very systematic and sort of, interwoven, right, form of disinformation campaign, right? A sort of form of propaganda, destabilizing sort of bot-driven campaign that sought to delegitimize the Black Lives Matter movement. And what I also found computationally after examining the prevalent hashtags and tying these hashtags to the tweets to examine to what extent hashtags indicated higher level frames, what I found emerging was a variety of different interesting agendas, network frames of these Black Lives Matter publics in 2016. They were trying to frame police brutality as nonstop, heartless, never-ending. And there were a variety of different hashtags that they use on a day-to-day basis to cite the lack of justice, the extent of violence against Black lives, the significance of naming, people that are killed by name, to suggest the significance and also to keep it in public narrative. The second thing they were doing is building bridges towards minority publics. In 2016, this was a new turn for the Black Lives Matter movement, in that they were interested not only in Black lives, but brown lives and Muslim lives and Aboriginal lives, including the North Dakota Access Pipeline, right? And they were very involved in that as well. They framed the movement also as a global movement. This is another shift in 2016. It hasn't been documented in years prior, right? The Black Lives Matter movement extended to Toronto, to Melbourne, to France, to London, as protests erupted in all of these different places. There was a progressive fight as well on Black Lives Matter between Bernie Sanders' support and Clinton's support. And this is where I'm doing some deeper investigation, because there are suggestions that much of Sanders' support in social media was a bot-driven sort of campaign to not only appear to heighten support for him, but destabilize support for Clinton. So I've already segmented those particular tweets that either have Feel the Burn and Bernie Sanders tags against the I'm with her Clinton tags, to see to what extent actors within that space could be identified readily computationally as bots. And for that, we can talk a little bit more later about some of the tools that you guys can use to try to detect a bot. There was a strong delegitimizing of the Black Lives movement, with All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter, which tends to be, if you were to follow this movement, something that's daily. Like, it's just there every time, all the time, ever present, right, as a delegitimizing sort of campaign. And then there was a pull towards trying to center Black Lives Matter's publics in terms of current events that were occurring in society, so that it was very news-oriented and very news-driven, right? Again, this is a public quite unlike many of the publics that I've studied before, in that it's a very political public, right? Extremely news-driven, current event glued, as well as very global and very connective, right, in terms of its building of bridges to other minority publics. So just to sum that up, and I'm still doing a fair amount of work as well on this particular subject, as well as through to the 2020 election. Black Lives Matter became a global public and used 2016 to build bridges to other publics. Its primary goal was to highlight and make visible police brutality against Black lives by the power of naming, by the power of protest activism, claiming geographic space. It was heavily trolled in 2016. Almost 40% of Black Lives Matter accounts that were, flagged or identified, 40% of those were driven by bots, and there was a strong delegitimizing. But it does reveal the current struggle that network publics face to address racism amidst the growing tide of white nationalism, hate speech, and anti-immigrant and minority sentiment online and offline. So these are just a snapshot of some of the projects that I've been working on most recently. I have been doing projects centered in computational methods since I was a graduate student back at UT Austin. I chose to mostly showcase these because these are the ones of the more current ones that I'm interested in and at the same time working on currently. So, I'd like to talk a little bit about the challenges now that we face ahead in our field utilizing computational social science. And I think one of the biggest challenges are who has access to data and how representative it is. I see this because it's always a question when I teach classes: how do you get data? How do you pull data? Where do you get your data from? What tools do you use? Do you have access to the fire hose or not? If you do pull a sample, how often is it? Is it every hour? Is it random? Where's it coming from? And we also realize at the same time that these companies are putting out massive data sets, right, for invited researchers, somewhat privileged, right, to apply and then get access to these data pools. And we don't actually know how representative that data is either, right? So if you, for example, were to go on Facebook's page, you'll see some invited calls, right, to be able to access data pools, you can invite and get an application, and then you can get access to that data. But I think we as academics and as researchers should question all of this, right? Because we should question, you know, what this data is, getting access to it, who are the privileged few that gets and who doesn't. We also have to understand that individuals themselves have a right to privacy, and there have been massive data breaches, malicious data mining. And in this space also, we have the computational propaganda, malicious bot-injected discourses going on at the same time, which makes it very difficult to figure out what you're examining, whether there's truth or you know, disinformation there. And this actual sort of trend we're seeing towards the malicious is a global issue, one that threatens the very fabric of our democracy and trust in the pillars of society. So, you know, I think a big thing to ask yourself is how reflective the data set is in terms of your particular study and what you're doing, and in trying to wrap your mind around who produces this data. It will also sort of orient you towards, when you examine this data, what are you getting out of it, right? What implications does it have? Now, as you well know, when you pull from a bounded community, it's less generalizable, right? So unless you do something in a predictive manner, right? So much of this, and the studies you're doing are case studies, right? But you triangulate many case studies and you eventually get to something that you could find some generalizability about it. Just like when I mentioned with the fake news, well, after I did all those many studies that pointed to the same finding, there were a bunch of others replicated by a series of different researchers that all pointed to the same thing. I think we could come away with a fairly robust finding there, that there appears to be more fake news generation spread, generated, created by the conservative and progressive public, right? As Kitchen rightly notes, the challenge in analyzing big data is coping with abundance, exhaustivity, and variety, timeliness and dynamism, messiness and uncertainty, high relationality, and the fact that much of what is generated has no specific question in mind or is a byproduct of another activity. So that's another thing to bear in mind. Like, we as researchers, we put a framework over what we're reviewing, right? But remember, when people are creating that is not their intent, right? They're just probably just mindlessly retweeting, right? With no actual desire to then be aggregated in the hashtag and then become part of this quantitative finding on your end, right? So again, you have to be very, very careful when you do pull from a community, because we don't know the motivations and the perceptions and the reasons that people are participating. This could sometimes lead to sort of erroneous conclusions, right, about what you're finding. The other thing is that we as researchers, of course, as computational scholars, we're very excited, right? I love coding, I love scripting, I love, you know, engaging in these forms of computational methodologies. But you have to remember, though, to never turn off your critical guides, right? And that is to understand that much of what you're examining is shaped by the affordances and restrictions of that platform. And these platforms have politics, right? So that you always have to keep sort of like a very critical mind, right, towards the fact that the output that you're even examining is shaped itself, right, by what's allowed, what isn't allowed, the gestures that are encouraged. You know, like is a much better button than unlike, right? So that's why like is more friendly to marketers and advertisers, right? So if they were to put an unlike, and I know all of the companies get an unlike, that's not going to look good. So that's why there's much preference for a like button, right, as opposed to something that's a thumbs down. For something like Facebook. It's also biased towards the participants. As we know, much less people participate in social media than are participating, which means that your findings tend to be just like a 10% sample. And you know what? When we've looked at data, we find that Twitter trends very, very rarely actually predict voting patterns. So what you also have to wrap your mind around is, what is this stream really representative of? And what we often find is that the stream is more reflective of temporal dynamics, of public attention and sentiment, versus indicators of the actual outcome. For example, you find that a lot of times it sort of presents us a public that is trying to figure it out, or reacting at the time, right, to what might be a public event that may not have staying power, right? In terms of affective publics, it provides us with their gestures towards that pre-emotive state, right, before emotion takes hold, right? So again, I think it's important to try to wrap your mind around what you're really looking at, right, when you are looking at social streams. The other thing to remember is that we're very tech-centric right now. I admit in my bias towards a preference to text over video or audio, because there was a large difficulty in transcribing. I think now the tools are getting a whole lot better, right, in terms of being able to access YouTube. And I actually think that there's a lot of ferment around producing tools right now for researchers to be able to sample into YouTube and get those transcripts going, right? Because for a lot of it, we do need something textual, right, to which we can do NLP and ML against, right? So I myself am doing a bit of work on visuals for this current year and onwards. So I encourage you guys. I feel like that's a very big area in our field right now. So if you find yourself looking for a challenge, this would be one. In terms of Facebook, Instagram, all the sharing of photos, as well as YouTube and sharing videos. And again, we need to ensure data is open, transparent. What would be great is if we could start providing standardized data sets, right? And I think a lot of academia is on board with this, producing sort of open source scripts, right, that you guys could all use to access. Many of it driven right now in Python and R, because there are, as well as we know, very good libraries that we can tap into as well. So I think that there's a lot of ferment in this area. So I wouldn't be too worried about this push towards the open movement, because I think that right now this is where much of us are in academia. Once we write a script, we put it up on GitHub, and we make sure that everyone has access to it. So, and there are several collaborative labs, not only with conferences like this, but also within universities themselves, right? The other thing I'd like to emphasize as you are young career scholars is to emphasize cross-collaboration. I worked a lot with computer science at the university. Not only do I actively mentor young computer scientists who often come to me and say, I don't know what to study, I just know how to do it. And then I'll sit with them and say, well, what are you interested in? And then they'll tell me their project, but they lack a theoretical framework, right? So I enjoy guiding young computer scientists like this, but I also enjoy collaborations, right, with existing computer science faculty, as well as, informatics and mathematicians and physicists, cognitive scientists, because sometimes we might lack that high level skill that a computer scientist might have. And, I myself am a social scientist. I have a minor in computer science, but I'm not a major in computer science. I have a minor in computer science, which means that obviously a computer scientist, I wouldn't put myself at the same level, right, with someone who has a PhD in computer science that is doing that day in, day out, right? So, where I fall short, I engage in team collaboration with other scholars that can do or assist or come alongside me in thinking through a problem and us breaking up the tasks into what is possible between and among us. So I see that as a very, very strong way to sort of strengthen, right, your skill set, because computational social science involves scripting, it involves NLP, it involves machine learning, it involves coding. Okay, and for that, you're not only going to need to do classes, that are, or do open source classes in things like Python and R, maybe a little bit of Java and JavaScript, a little bit of database languages like SQL, but you should also, join forces with computational scholars across the platform. So just to finalize, I have a few more minutes. I do want to also make a plug for the significance of platform politics. As a social scientist, we don't study the analysis of data the same way someone from maybe the hard scientist might, because we are very, very attuned to the context, to the embeddedness, right, to the inclusion of social, political, cultural, and economic variables. And I think it's very, very difficult to divorce our study of these social offerings and the output from the understanding that this output exists within an algorithmic structure, a structure that not only makes visible what it wants us to see, shapes what we produce and how we produce it, but also that there's materiality, there's There's economic considerations with private corporations. And, you know, again, I'm very sensitive to this whole politics of the platforms itself, the idea that we need to critically sort of understand and engage with these algorithms, understanding that not only is there good, but maliciousness occurring with bots that distort, seek, amplify, and make viral fake narratives, that they're paradoxical and ambivalent. Algorithms and bots, they can be both good and harmful when injected, and that the platform shape the data we create, curate, and scrape. And we have to also ask ourselves what role the platforms and their algorithmic architectures play in shaping the data that we utilize for our computational social science projects. So what am I doing right now? I am continuing my work on hate speech and toxicity. I'm doing a lot of computational linguistics right now, which involves, you know, a lot of parsing of the sentences and tagging and classification. And as I try to figure out how to detect, you know, not only via sentiment markers, latent, but also manifest, on social media streams. I'm looking at viral images. A lot of the work that I'm presenting for the political science conference in August are around visual viral images and the role they play in shaping our discourse online. And then I am already collecting data on the 2020 election across different progressive, conservative, issue-based communities. But also, I'm also interested in traditional media, which I know we tend to forget a lot in this computational social science arena. But I think that it's really important to sort of examine the way media is covering our society, to be able to understand not only what maybe publics that disagree with them, why are they arguing about media's bias, fake quality, but what is media covering when it's covering an election? We've heard a lot about the negatives of emphasis on sensationalism and horse race coverage, but I think that it behooves us to also not only study the social and what publics are creating, but also study what our pillars of society are, the traditions that we hold dear that keep our democracy stable are doing. And that not only includes the output from political elites, politicians and our government officials, for which we could study their social equivalents on Twitter and all that, but we should also study our mass media. So with that, I want to say thank you. It's exactly 12:30. So I want to thank you for letting me share a little bit of what I've been doing, and I'm happy to talk with any of you after this talk. So thank you.
So if anyone has a specific question, we can do it now. Otherwise, we'll break for lunch. Sharon can stay for 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll reconvene at the end of lunch to start the exam.
Sourcing information as we tackle right now. I want to put out comments